In April 2025, French anti-terrorism prosecutors arrested an Algerian consular official over the alleged kidnapping of a social media critic. Within days, Algeria expelled 12 French diplomats. France reciprocated. The crisis escalated rapidly. Algeria and France each withdrew their ambassadors, marking the most severe rupture in Franco-Algerian relations since 1962. Beneath the standoff lies 132 years of colonial history and decades of unresolved tension, shaping not only bilateral ties, but ripple across European and African diplomacy. Today, we examine the roots, escalation, and regional significance of this crisis. To understand this standoff, we must start in 1830, when France invaded Algeria, not as a mere colony, but as an extension of France itself. Algeria became legally integrated, divided into 3 departments, under direct rule from Paris. This absorption was enforced by extraordinary violence. Algerian farmers lost their land to European settlers, and the population fell sharply. Nearly 500,000 died through military campaigns and scorched earth tactics by 1870. The War of Independence from 1954 to 1962 left lasting scars. More than 1 million Algerians died through torture, forced relocations, and regroupment camps. Yet, after independence, France never issued a comprehensive apology for its colonial legacy. Ambiguous statements of regret have done little to ease lingering resentment. For both sides, every flare-up, from disputes over immigration to economic policy, harkens back to this unresolved past. France's approach to its Maghreb neighbors was shaped by their paths to independence. While Algeria fought a brutal war, Morocco negotiated a quieter exit in 1956. This difference laid the groundwork for what many observers deem to be a consistently favorable French posture toward Morocco. This contrast is especially visible in the Western Sahara dispute. Since 1975, Morocco has occupied Western Sahara, despite the lack of UN recognition. For decades, France supported calls for a UN-supervised referendum. But in July 2024, President Macron publicly endorsed Morocco's autonomy plan, a dramatic reversal that brought France in line with Morocco's position and with some global partners, but broke with international consensus. For Algeria, which strongly supports Sahrawi self-determination, this was seen as a betrayal of regional neutrality, deepening the diplomatic rift and cementing the sense that France's privileged partnership firmly favored Rabat. In response, Algeria recalled its ambassador and suspended a major treaty. Visa policy became a battleground long before the latest diplomatic rupture. In 2021, France sharply reduced the number of visas granted to North African nationals as a punitive measure over repatriation disputes, slashing visas for both Algeria and Morocco by 50% and for Tunisia by 30%. For many Algerians, this was deeply personal. Families separated, students stranded, businesses disrupted. The move sparked outrage, with Algeria and Morocco seeing the strictest reductions and Tunisia expressing public regret, making clear that the policy struck hardest at France's main Maghreb partners. These unprecedented cuts were officially justified as a response to the 3 governments' refusal to facilitate the return of their citizens under expulsion orders. However, in the Maghreb, the cuts were widely seen as part of a broader French pattern, using economic and bureaucratic leverage to reward cooperation and punish perceived defiance. Against this historical backdrop, recent events have erupted into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. The latest fallout centers on Amir Bikours, Amir DZ, a prominent Algerian social media influencer known for his outspoken criticism of the Algerian government and its leadership. Now living in France and granted asylum in 2023, Algeria has issued 9 international arrest warrants against Bikours, accusing him of fraud and terrorism-related offenses, though French courts have dismissed these as politically motivated. In April 2024, Bikours was reportedly kidnapped near his home by men posing as police and released a day later. In April 2025, French authorities indicted 3 Algerian nationals, including a consular official, for their alleged involvement in the abduction. As the diplomatic standoff escalated, Algeria retaliated, expelling French staff and calling the arrests a national insult. France mirrored these actions, gutting bilateral communication and cooperation. Unlike previous spats, almost every official channel was abruptly shuttered, a sign that the underlying issues have grown too significant for quiet diplomacy. Then, in July 2025, the standoff escalated further. Algeria formally revoked all special access cards for French diplomatic staff at its ports and airports, citing violations of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the international treaty that protects diplomatic staff and ensures the secure exchange of official communications between countries. Algeria argued this was necessary after French authorities restricted Algerian diplomatic pouches in Paris, a serious breach of those protections. With this step, both countries reduced their diplomatic relations to the chargé d'affaires level, and official statements acknowledged that ties were now totally blocked. But the freeze between Algiers and Paris is more than a bilateral feud. It's the latest chapter in a much broader unraveling of French influence across Africa. Algeria is not alone in pushing back. Since 2020, countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have expelled French troops or pivoted to Russian partnerships, frustrated by what they see as continued French attempts to control or dictate their affairs. Algeria never belonged to France's CFA franc currency zone, nor did it host French military bases on its soil. Still, it has long experienced French pressure, whether through strict visa rules, investment deals set on French terms, or diplomatic maneuvers. Bolstered by substantial natural gas reserves and expanding trade relationships with China, Russia, and Turkey, Algeria is well positioned to pursue an independent foreign policy with greater leverage and sustainability. But this high-level diplomatic standoff has direct, practical effects. Beyond posturing and diplomacy, it threatens vital economic ties, disrupts energy flows, and puts crucial security cooperation at risk for both countries. Algeria supplies about 8% of Europe's natural gas, with France receiving a significant share during peak demand. In 2023 alone, the two nations traded over €8 billion in goods and services. If the rift deepens, energy supplies and major French commercial interests, from utilities to automobile manufacturers, could face serious disruption. Security cooperation is also at stake. France and Algeria, though often uneasy, have worked together against Sahelian terror groups and on managing migration. As relations freeze, intelligence sharing and migration deals become harder, with potential security consequences for Europe. The rupture is being watched closely across the Maghreb and beyond. Tunisia sits uneasily between the two rivals. Morocco edges closer to France but risks alienation regionally. Some EU members worry about migration or energy security, and may sidestep Paris to maintain their direct ties with Algeria, fraying the EU's collective approach. Within the African Union, Algeria commands influence as a champion of anti-colonial causes. If the dispute is framed as resistance to neo-colonialism, France's diplomatic stock could fall further, potentially pushing other African states to reconsider their alliances and partnerships with Paris. So, where does this all lead? 3 scenarios are possible. 1. Tactical de-escalation. Both sides seek a quiet compromise to restore baseline ties, perhaps by France dropping charges or releasing the detained Algerian consular official, and both countries toning down their public rhetoric. However, without addressing the underlying historical grievances, such truces are unlikely to last. 2. Strategic realignment. Algeria doubles down on pivoting to non-Western partners, boosting ties with China, Russia, and the Gulf. If this succeeds, other African countries may follow, reshaping the diplomatic landscape. 3. Escalation and complications. The confrontation intensifies. Each side applies new economic or political pressure, further disrupting energy supplies, trade, and regional security cooperation. This path risks broader instability, with spillover effects across North Africa and Europe. The coming months will reveal whether this crisis cools, transforms, or deepens, reshaping relations in ways no one yet can fully predict. But beneath these shifting strategies and scenarios lies a deeper force driving the crisis. At its core, the standoff stems from unresolved wounds left by colonial rule. France has stopped short of offering a full apology or taking responsibility for the violence and abuses of its colonial era in Algeria, a long-standing barrier to true reconciliation and partnership. Yet even as this painful legacy shapes the present impasse, the wider African landscape is undergoing a dramatic transformation. With traditional colonial ties fraying, African nations are increasingly seeking new partners and opportunities. reshaping their options and their leverage far beyond the old playbook. Globally, countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and Gulf states have stepped up their engagement in Africa, providing African nations with concrete alternatives to relying on their former colonial powers for trade, investment, and diplomatic support. Algeria stands out as a prominent advocate of diversified non-alignment, actively broadening partnerships across all regions while firmly rejecting subordination to any single bloc. For France, this means its former approach, balancing influence through privileged ties and economic pressure, offers diminishing returns. As more African states assert their sovereignty and diversify partnerships, French influence will continue to dwindle. From Tunisia to Senegal, other African states are watching closely to see how this plays out. This is more than a diplomatic standoff, it marks a wider turning point. The current impasse between Algeria and France underscores a difficult truth. France's once privileged path to influence in Algeria is gone. Algeria's assertive stance makes clear that old patterns of dominance and special access are no longer sustainable. For France, adapting to new realities is now a necessity, not a choice.